Hey there, and welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabrielle Nicolay. I am a toddler whisperer, a speech therapist, and a parent coach. And today I have Jessica Fein with me. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Jessica is the author of Breathtaking, a memoir of family, dreams, and broken genes. And we're going to get into exactly what that means. But Jessica, set the scene for why you wrote this book.
I wrote this book because I had been living for almost 2 decades in a world that I knew was really, in many ways, unimaginable to people.
Mm.
It was very, very intense. I wanted to bear witness to what was happening. Um, and at the same time, I felt like while on the one hand, people were like, how do you do it? This is so unimaginable. I also felt like what we were going through was so universal in that we were learning how to make a life of joy and meaning in a world that was so very different from what we had ever envisioned, that was so out of our control. And I know this is like totally general, and everybody who's listening who hasn't read the book is like, what is she even talking about? But I'm sure we'll get there. But I wanted to bear witness. I wanted to control the narrative a little bit. I wanted to share my family members with the world. I've lost a lot of family most recently, and the star of the book, my 17-year-old daughter, and I wanted to share her with the world.
And you did so beautifully. I was telling you before we hit record, I was shedding some tears. I may do that again, because you accomplished your goal. If I can,
Good,
weigh in
thank
on
you.
that.
Thank you. I'm so glad.
Yeah,
And I
she.
don't feel bad that you said you cried. I
No,
always feel, as we were talking about before, I headed up a creative team for decades. And what I always said is you got to make them laugh or cry or both. If you haven't done that, you're not doing your job. So hopefully there were some laughs as well.
absolutely. And I think speaking to this universality, and I promise we'll get into like what the hell we're talking about in a second, but it's totally true. What you managed to do, and again, we'll get into kind of some of the details, is to describe both Dahlia's life and your family's life as completely normal in its extremity and also completely extreme in its normalcy,
Oh, I love that. I love that so much.
right? Because it's just life.
It's
That's
just
what you
like,
did in this book, is like, you know what? You can look at this and you can feel all kinds of ways about it, but it's just my life, and here's what happened.
oh, I'm so glad you're recording this because this is just great. I love that description.
Good. So let's tell the people sort of a little bit about your journey, because it was not easy for you to become a parent.
Correct.
And I think that is the case for many listeners here. The theme of this podcast is complicated kids, because getting them is complicated sometimes, and then being their parent is also complicated. And so just walk us
Yes,
through.
let's tell the people. Okay. So, well, my husband and I met in college and we dated for a long time before we got married. And so 10 years, we were in our late 20s, and then we set about making a family the conventional way. And that wasn't working out for us. And we became increasingly creative. And we did 5 years of fertility treatments and 25 procedures. And we were very intimate with the Boston medical community. Let's just put it that way. And somewhere around year 4, we decided to simultaneously pursue adoption. And what happened was we started to fall in love with that with that path.
Mm.
We really started to not just think of it as like second choice, booby prize. We really became very enamored of the idea of building our family that way. So after 5 years, we found ourselves in Guatemala and we adopted 3 children, not all at once. We did an every 2 year kind of thing, and found ourselves then with 3 gorgeous, fabulous humans. And we had our family of 5. And we thought that the tough part was over. We thought the complicated part was over. And we were very naive in that thinking. Because even if we hadn't had happened to us what happened, we all know it's always complicated in some way or another. But what happened in our case is that my daughter, who was the middle of the three, Dahlia, um, started to show some symptoms that seemed to me to be out of the norm. She wasn't developing in the same way that her older sibling did, or in the same way her younger sibling would turn out to develop. And so there were balance issues and there were speech issues. And I raised my hand and, not tapped the shoulder of the doctors, and they said, give it time, give it time. And I had early intervention come out and they said, she's fine. She's on the lower end of average. And this kept happening. I mean, I had early intervention out again and again, and started to think, oh my God, I'm that parent, I'm that parent.
I'm going to pause you there because this is so important. And I really just want to highlight this for folks who are listening. You had a sense that there was something going on, and I know we're going to talk more about that. And you were dismissed or tolerated for some period of time before the people who were supposed to know better kind of said, it's kind of fine, don't worry. And you knew better. And for anybody who's listening who has this feeling, you do know better, and you find the people who are going to take you seriously.
Yes, yes, and yes. I had one person come out to observe Dahlia, and she said, there's nothing wrong with this child. She's just not paying attention. That one always stuck with me. I mean, there's like so many reasons we could do a whole episode just on that comment. But yes, parents definitely listen to your intuition. And it's funny, I thought a lot about this whole, well, we have that third sense or, sixth sense, whatever it is, mother's intuition. And I'm like, well, mother's intuition, they say it's a biological response. It's actually a real thing. And no, we just, no matter how our kids came to us, we know our kids. And so, yeah, of course, I stuck with it and stuck with it. And finally, a doctor said, okay, what are you afraid of? And I heard these words coming out of my mouth that I hadn't even processed, which is, I'm afraid there's something wrong in her brain. And he said, I don't think it's the case, but why don't we do a hearing test? Because it was issues of speech and issues of balance, let's do hearing. And in fact, she was diagnosed with a mild to moderate hearing loss. It was something that would be corrected with hearing aids. Now, had that been the end of the story, I got to tell you, I mean, I was really freaked out. I was really, really freaked out about the idea of hearing aids, which all these years later, and in retrospect, I think, my goodness, what a blessing that there were these little things we could put in our ears and they were going to solve the problem, which they did temporarily fix that part of the problem. Yeah. But the thing was, we had no idea why she had hearing loss. Was it genetic? Was it something that happened? Did she have virus as a baby before we brought her home to Massachusetts? We just didn't know. So we were sent for genetic testing. And again, I'll pause there because I know so many families who have to fight and fight and fight to get genetic testing. It is not easy. And it surely wasn't easy back then. But because she was adopted, there were so many question marks that we got sent. And in Dahlia's case, it was an immediate diagnosis of an ultra-rare mitochondrial disease. Now, mitochondrial disease often cannot be diagnosed that quickly. In fact, it takes an average of many years typically to get a mitochondrial disease diagnosis. But because Dahlia's was so pervasive in her blood, it came up right away. And we were called into the doctor's office. We were told Dahlia does not need to be with you. And we sat there with two people we had never met before, the geneticist and I don't know, maybe a social worker, who knows. And there we were given this decree that Dahlia had an ultra rare degenerative disease called myoclonic epilepsy, ragged red fibers, MRF syndrome.
And I will tell you, off the tongue.
Which, well, it does now because I have now. A lot of times.
Back up a second. They said Dahlia does not need to be with you?
at the appointment.
Oh, at the appointment. I was like, hold up. Okay.
Oh, good.
I
No,
went
no,
in
no.
a
At the
totally different
appointment,
direction.
which
Okay.
just again, in retrospect, like should have known there was going to be something big was happening.
Okay.
But it was a diagnosis that made no sense to us on any level. It didn't make any sense when we looked at our fabulous little girl to think that there was this insidious thing lurking inside of her. It didn't make any sense when they said it's degenerative. What does that mean? And it didn't make any sense when they said it's a mitochondrial disease. Her mitochondria aren't working properly. And I was like, what are mitochondria? And like, if they're not working properly, let's just give her a transplant and, we'll fix it. Was really my overriding thing. I didn't have any clue what it really meant.
Yeah.
And while that is largely a reflection of me and perhaps my ignorance, it is also a reflection of the fact that when you have a rare disease, there's so little data that it is not uncommon for the doctors to say, this could move forward in a multitude of ways. We cannot really give you a clear path forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's absolutely right. When you have very few data points, you just don't know. And within even these small communities, and I'm aware of several other kind of rare genetic disorders where there are, Facebook groups and all of this kind of stuff. And, some kids are doing very well into early adulthood, and some kids are not, not making it that long.
Even, I mean, Murph is very, very rare, 2 in a million. And then later Dahlia got a secondary diagnosis, which made her one of 6 in the world. But even within the Murph syndrome community, because it's genetic, it is not uncommon to find a family where multiple family members have it. Mm-hmm. And even within that family, it can manifest in wildly different ways, ranging from, one person might just get migraines and one person might not survive. So, there really is a lot of variety.
Yeah. Yeah. And so from there, I imagine the floor opened up. And then what?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to go home with a diagnosis like this and know that on the one hand, everything in your life has just changed, right? And on the other hand, absolutely nothing has changed.
Pause there for a second, because this is true no matter the diagnosis. It can be a very rare genetic disorder. It can be something as common, and I can't even believe I'm going to say this, as common as autism or ADHD. The diagnosis means some things have changed, and yet nothing has changed.
Nothing. And I always thought, oh, if only we can have a diagnosis, then we'll get the treatment and we'll be on our way.
Yeah.
It never occurred to me we'd get a diagnosis where there is no treatment.
Right. Yeah.
And I will say, and we can come back to this later, because you brought up ADHD, I do have a lot of experience with that as well. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners do. Yeah. And, I have another child with ADHD and learning differences. And I want to acknowledge those parents, because I will tell you, and you'll hear that what I went through on the medical front was so very, very intense. But the other stuff is just as stressful. And even back in the thick of it, I acknowledged that. And it was always surprising to people. Yeah. It was just as stressful for me to try to wrap my arms around, try to parent, still is, the learning differences, the ADHD, as this very intense medical stuff.
And in some ways, let's just stay there for a second. When you have a kid with a hidden disability, it can be, in some ways, again, and nobody's comparing, we're not comparing apples to apples, so let's not even do that. But there are some things that are more challenging about parenting a child who has a hidden disability versus a child who clearly has medical issues that need to be addressed.
Yes? Sure. I mean, I will tell you, at the time, the city I live in at the time was a town. In the past few years, it's changed. Okay. But as a town, it was the largest town in the country. Okay. I tell you that because we were told some years in by the school system, your daughter is the most complicated, this truly happened, complicated child in our town. Okay. The most. Now, right, I don't know what one is supposed to do with that, right. But it was like, that is a contest I do not want to be winning. No. But again, that was something that was like, nobody ever quote unquote blamed her, right? And I will tell you, there are a lot of behaviors that come along with the other stuff that we were just mentioning, where the child is blamed. You know, come on, snap out of it, get it together. Why do you do that? You know, all that kind of stuff. And I never knew what to expect. I didn't know what to expect on the medical side either. But, you know, again, it's just, it's very different. And yet, what looks to be the most complicated in the whole town isn't necessarily on a day-to-day basis, this, you know, feeling that way. Anyway, so we go home and nothing has really changed, but everything's changed. And what happened for the next 4 years is a very, very, very slow progression of the disease. So we had more weekly therapies, we had more medications she had to take every day. We had more equipment, you know, her wobbly walking meant she needed leg braces and then a walker and then a stroller and ultimately a wheelchair. Or her hearing aids needed to be turned up and up and up, you know, things like that. But when I look back on it, I feel like until age 9, okay, she was still in mainstream school. We were still flying on family vacations, that kind of thing. And then the other shoe dropped. When she was 9, we went on a family trip to Florida and she caught a cold. And when you have such a compromised system, something as seemingly harmless as a little cold, which both of her siblings had, and they were still like, you know, in the pool and doing all the stuff, landed her in the hospital. And ultimately, she aspirated and got pneumonia and was intubated.
Yeah.
There in a hospital in Florida. Again, we're from Massachusetts. So then a different journey began.
Yeah.
And we had a medical jet back to Boston. And speaking of complications, I mean, that alone, getting that medical jet is a
Oh,
whole
that
story.
chapter in the book is a ringer. And I mean, it is, it's you've written the book, so it's high drama for the book, and you can just feel it. Like, it's very well written and it's very intense to experience, honestly. So we'll save that for the people who want to definitely buy the
Yes.
book.
Yes, buy the book and you can read about that.
Yeah, it's a total, like, there's all kinds of twists and turns. And yes, to say that we got on a medical jet and make it sound like,
makes it sound, yeah. So a week later, we were back in Massachusetts and we were admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit at Mass General Hospital. And I remember we were admitted, and it was 1 week before her 9th birthday. And I said to the person admitting us, but can you just promise me that we'll be out of the hospital by her birthday? And, you know, you just look anywhere you can for assurances, you know, it's just and the doctor said, I can't promise you that, but you won't still be in ICU. Well, we stayed in ICU for 3 months. We did her 9th birthday in the hospital, and she was very, very, very weak, and she kept going into respiratory failure. And over that time period, she really lost a lot of functionality, including the ability to breathe independently. And so when we left the hospital 3 months later, she could no longer walk at all. And she had a tracheotomy, which in her case, not always with a trach, but in her case meant she also lost the ability to speak and to eat. And she became ventilator dependent. So she was now that, by definition, she was very, very intensely dependent on other people and on highly sophisticated medical care.
yeah, she's
And
now
she became
considered medically fragile.
very medically fragile. And she was an eyes-on
Yeah.
person, meaning myself or my husband or a nurse trained specifically in her care needed to be watching her 24/7.
Pause there. And some of this will come with perspective, and I understand that. In the moment, and I just want to highlight this for people, because for those of you who are listening, there are moments always in life when we have these choice points and we have to make decisions. And what I really want to highlight here, and then I want to hear, Jessica, how you navigated this, is that no one else can make these decisions for you. You can ask the doctor, you can ask your mom, you can ask your friends, what should you do? But at the end of the day, it's you and your parenting partner if you have one. Do you want to speak to
And
that a little bit?
what, and yes, and by the way, if you and your parenting partner are not on the same page,
Mm. Mhm.
because we know, first of all, we know that well over half of parents of children with special needs, let alone these kinds of, very intense medical needs, don't stay together. And you can see why. I mean, that was a real blessing for us, is that we were on the same page.
Mhm.
And yes, there are decisions every minute of the day, and there are a few big ones. I mean, we had to make the decision whether or not to give her a trach,
Yep.
right? That was the big decision. And we knew she was not leaving the hospital without a trach.
Mhm.
And we also knew that that was going to take away her ability to speak, to eat, all these things. And so, yeah, it is intense, intense decisions. And you wish that there could be somebody who came in and said, this is the thing,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And then sometimes you look for the grown up. I mean, I certainly did that. I was like, okay, where's the grown up here? And then I was like, oh man, that's me, right?
Where's the person who knows, who can
Where's
take
the
care
person
of
who
this?
knows? Yeah, I
Yeah.
need the adult in the room. And yeah.
And you guys, it comes out very clearly in the book. And I want to let you finish your narrative. And also, it comes out very clearly that you decided, knew, drew from this certainty that Dahlia's life was certainly, whoa, I'm going to tear up, certainly worth living
Mhm.
in whatever form it was taking. And I found that so beautiful. And again, to this issue of choice making and all of that, there are many, many choices to make, and everybody has to make them themselves. The thing I find beautiful, again, about your story is you really honored her life as being valuable just because it was her life, not based on her function or what she could or couldn't do.
And it was so valuable and to so many people, and so life-changing for so many people, and the impact she made. And I hear it all the time. I'll, run into somebody who's like, I was your child's, speech aid in second grade or whatever, and I think about her every time, such and such, or, I mean, the big doctors will say to me, I think about your daughter when this happens, when that happens. I mean, she had this impact on people. She really, truly, was spectacular, you
And
know?
this is something, it's so interesting. It is, because I have had a client like this who made a huge impact on me and is no longer with us, several. And it's, it is a blessing. It is like just plain and simple.
Mhm.
As complicated, as hard, as gut wrenching, as breathtakingly difficult. And yet, there's this transcendence about it that maybe isn't quite as obvious when you don't have as complicated a kid, honestly.
Right. Yes, I think that is 100% correct. And sometimes not as obvious when you're in it,
Yes, also.
right? I mean, there was so much when I was in it that I couldn't even appreciate because I was in it, because I was in this very intense minute to minute thing.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, the most kind of notable example of that is happened the day Dahlia died.
Mm,
When the first time I was in Dahlia's room without her,
mm,
I looked around and became totally overwhelmed by the medical equipment in the room. The food pump and the ventilator and the cough assist machine and the Hoyer lift and the this, that, and a gigantic closet full of supplies. And it was very clear that I was looking at a very sophisticated hospital room, which was her bedroom. Now, I had spent 8 years in this room, most of the time in this room, and all of that had just faded to the background. I was so focused on Dahlia and the world we were creating here in the room or wherever we went. I mean, it was totally the central place for our house. Most families, it's the kitchen. For us, it was Dahlia's room. And I realized when other people would come into the room, friends or, whatever, not so many people, but when they did, they saw all that medical equipment,
Mm.
right? I hadn't appreciated it because again, I was so focused on Dahlia. And I think that the situation was so huge that I couldn't really grasp it all in its entirety because I would have blown over.
And this is a gift of the human mind.
Right? It was a
Yeah,
gift of the human mind.
yeah,
It was like, what are we doing in this moment? Like, what book are we reading, or what med are we giving, or whatever is happening?
yep,
But it is not, oh my God, everything is so huge and big and whatever. Because who could function like that? You cannot.
that's right.
I think in the book, I compare it to one of those pointillism paintings where, when you're up close, you see each individual dot. And you need to back up to understand that it's a, canoe in a field and a dinner party or whatever the picture is.
Yeah,
We just didn't back up. We didn't take in the big picture because we were so focused on every single dot.
yeah, yeah. And we need both,
Yeah.
right? Like at various points in this journey, right? We need to be right up in it, and then we can zoom out at certain other times.
Yeah.
And so this book is certainly a zooming out, and just a beautiful testament to Dahlia's life and to your family. And I just thank you for writing it. Thank you for sharing her with us.
Well, thank you for giving me a place to share it even more broadly. I really appreciate it.
It's really, really fantastic. Is there anything else? We're going to close out here in a second. Is there anything else that we need to know?
I think that what I want people to know, first of all, is, like we said, you don't pick this up and it is devastating in many ways, but it's also, I hope, really life affirming, as we've talked about. And I think for me, the thing that I realized, well, there were a couple things, and I hope this comes across too. The idea that you can have absolutely the single worst thing in the world happening to you. I mean, objectively, anybody's going to say the worst thing that can happen to you is you lose a child. I mean, that's just kind of, right? And you can be on that journey and on that path for whatever period of time. And it can be the worst thing. And it is horrible and frightening and traumatizing and all the stuff. And you can also be living in a place of beauty and joy and meaning, that those things can happen together, that the joy and the sorrow can hold hands. And that to me was such a big learning and something that we took really seriously, making sure that the life, because Dahlia was just a kid wanting to be a kid, and her siblings were just siblings wanting to be kids. And so we had to create an environment that was not so heavy all the time. So that's the one thing. And then the other thing I would say is, we are capable of so much more than we think we are. Never in a million years would I have thought I could handle something like this. No way. And no way I would have raised my hand for it. And we do it because it's our life, it's our family, it's the hand we were dealt, it's our children. And I think that for whatever reason, your family's life is complicated. You might not think you can do it, but you can, because again, we are capable as human beings of so much more than we think.
Ugh, I love that so much. And for people who aren't especially feeling that way, get some help with that, because you're allowed to feel, and I'm talking directly to the listeners now, you are allowed to feel the way that Jessica feels about her life. And her example is brilliant and beautiful. And so thank you for sharing it with us, Jessica. I so appreciate your time here today.
Oh, well, thank you. And, I would just invite people who are listening to connect if they want to at jessicafeinstories.com. Jessica Fein is Fein. And I do a lot of writing on these themes, and I do have my own podcast called I Don't Know How You Do It. So yeah, check it out.
We will link to all of that in the show notes. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you.